distinguished guests, faculty members, students, and everyone present today. Good evening. This is Samira Tawassul, lecturer, Department of English and Humanities at ULab, welcoming you all to today's public talk titled The Relevance of Fanon and Marx Today. Today's talk will be presented by Dr. Nagesh Rao, lecturer in University Studies, Colgate University, New York. After his talk, Dr. Rao will be in conversation with Dr. Azfar Hussain, Summer Distinguished Professor, Department of English and Humanities, ULab, and Director, Graduate Program in Social Innovation, and Associate Professor of Integrative, Religious and Intercultural Studies, Grand Valley State University, Michigan. To formally begin today's program, I would like to now invite Professor Shamshad Mortaza, Pro Vice Chancellor, ULab, and Dean, School of Arts and Humanities, to welcome the audience and share a few words with us.
Thank you, Samira. Thank you so much for coming. And this wonderful Thursday afternoon is never easy, beating Dhaka traffic, and we're actually waiting for some guests. But we already have our speakers here today, and we have Dr. Nagesh Rao. So we have already heard that so he teaches at Colgate College in New York, and we'll be in conversation with our very own Dr. Azfar Hussain. So the conversation that we're going to have at the talk, as you can see, that is on Fanon and Marx, so very relevant to students of English literature and as well as cultural studies. Dr. Azfar will introduce our speaker, so I'm not going to get into detail of our speaker today, but it's my proud privilege to say a few words about Azfar Hussain. So I'm addressing him as my teacher because he was my teacher, and we started. I studied under him, so he taught me William Blake in second year. Then John Donne. Metaphysical poetry, then I did Shakespeare with him, and then he left, on a Fulbright, and I had to follow him the following year. So I got a Fulbright as well. So went to George Washington University, for his masters, and as you have already heard that, so he's right now in Michigan. But we're very proud because he is the Vice President of Global Center for Advanced Studies. So this is board of kind of an atomic bomb of scholars. So all the global thought power is over there. So really proud and privileged to know that Dr. Azfar Hussain is among those luminaries. So he is a GCAS professor of world literature and interdisciplinary studies. And before that, he taught at Bowling Green University and Oklahoma State University in the US. And of course, when he was in Dhaka, he taught at Jahangirnagar University and North-South University. And here at ULab, so we are privileged to have him every summer as the summer distinguished professor. And he is very well published, and he's a public intellectual whom we all know for his very strong stance on land, labor, and other political issues. So that's us to start for you, and I'm sure he does not need any introduction. And what is even more interesting is that I went to his redbyprofessor.com website this morning, and I have visited yours as well. So no. And very interestingly, so he is dubbed as a very funky, funny professor, which I am here to endorse. So we have a good time. And Dr. Nagesh Rao, so Azfar was pulling his leg as a Bangladeshi Jamai. So I'm sure he's going to make fun of that as well. So during the course of the conversation. But for us, it's a rare honor and privilege to have you. So thank you for accepting our invitation. So without further ado, so may I invite the guests on the stage. Thank you, sir.
So thank you so much, Samshad sir. So ladies and gentlemen, we are moving on to the main section of our today's event. We have on stage Dr. Nagesh Rao and Dr. Azfar Hussain. Dr. Azfar Hussain will be moderating today's public talk on the relevance of Fanon and Marx today. Over to you, sir.
Damn, that was quite an introduction, Shamsad, and I don't know what to say about that. You sounded very generous and very glowing. And thanks for the introduction. And thanks everyone for being with us. I'm deeply delighted to be a part of this event organized by ULAB's Department of English and Humanities. And I also thank the department, acclaimed and reputed as it is, for organizing and sponsoring all kinds of national and international conferences and symposia and colloquia and public lectures and public talks on a staggering variety of topics, events that I think variously charge our lives here in that with intellectual energia and elan, to say the least. And for that, I thank you, that's Vice Chancellor, of course, our Shamsad, and our department chair, Professor Arifah, for their support. Arifah is not here with us, unfortunately. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I apologize. But right there, I see, empirically verified. So today's event is one that I really look forward to, given the topic that continues to constitute my area of interest. And of course, given the speaker, one whose words and works I have followed with much interest, and one whom I have taken as a comrade of mine. So now I'm asked to introduce our speaker. Of course, I'd be happy to do it. But before I introduce them, I think I would do well to say a few words about the genesis and even the implications of the topic, of the very topic that our speaker has rather, let me put it this way, consented to choose. I'm not saying that he has chosen, I would say consented to choose. So that's my turn of expression here. In fact, in a quick exchange with Dr. Rao, given his interests and expertise, both intellectual and political, and of course the intellectual is political, was also political, I ended up asking him if he would be interested in speaking on Marx and Fanon, their relevance to the contemporary, on their relevance to our conjunction, to the contemporary conjunction. He immediately and generously answered the affirmative, while readily reversing the order of the names, saying, yes, Fanon and Marx, they are relevant today. So I found that intriguing, of course. And honestly, from that time on, I've been thinking of a Fanonian reading of Marx and a Marxian reading of Fanon in the interest of revolutionary politics itself at a conjuncture characterized by the constitutive contradictions of and crisis and even barbarisms of capitalism, always racialized and imperial as things. And for me, as far as Bangladesh is concerned, the question always is, what does a revolutionary politics look like in a country like Bangladesh now? Of course, by no means am I imposing this question on our speaker right now. It's just that today's topic has kept me moving in a number of directions. One of which has to do with what might be called the indigenization of Fanon and Marx, one that I wanted to share with you. So that being said, let me introduce our distinguished speaker now, Dr. Nagesh Rao. I call him Nagesh. He earned his PhD at Brown University in 2001 and taught English and Postcolonial Studies at Wake Forest University and the College of New Jersey before joining Colgate University in New York in 2014, where he is currently a lecturer in the university's core program within cultural studies, broadly defined. His research focuses on the literary and cultural politics of decolonization. His work has appeared in journals such as Race and Class, South Asian Review, Interdisciplinary Literary Studies, Postcolonial Text, and Prose Studies. He is a long-time socialist activist and has written for publications such as International Socialist Review, Socialist Worker, and Monthly Review. Now, let me welcome Professor Nagesh Rao to present his talk on the relevance of Fanon and Marx today. Professor Nagesh Rao, and let's greet him with a round of applause. I call it applause. It's a word that's come from James Joyce. Tap, applause, tap. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Hussain, for that wonderful introduction. And I also want to thank Professor Murtaza and Professor Arifur Rahman for inviting me and for organizing this event. It truly is an honor and a privilege to be here talking to you on this subject that's been close to my heart for a while. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for organizing this, and thank you all for coming out on a Thursday evening. I know you have better things to do, so I hope this will still be worth it. Could we actually lower the slides, screen, please? So, the title of my talk is "The Relevance of Fanon and Marx Today," and initially, when I thought about this talk, when we were talking about it, I reversed the order, like Professor Hussain said, made it the relevance of Fanon and Marx, because somehow I felt that in Bangladesh, in Bengal in general, in South Asia, in most of our spaces, one ought to be able to take it as read, as given, that Marx remains relevant. One ought to be able to take it for granted that a vision of society which is so radically democratic, so radically emancipatory, continues to be relevant in a world that's defined by massive inequality on the one hand, war, imperialism on the other, and the disasters of climate change, various axes of oppression that people have to live under. In this kind of world, one would have thought that Marxism doesn't require justification, and the relevance of Marxism is very clear. And I felt that people would probably be less familiar with Fanon and the relevance of Fanon for our times than the relevance of Marx. So that was the assumption that I was working with initially. So I'm just going to go through, and in 20 to 30 minutes, obviously the job here, the task here is not to provide some sort of comprehensive analysis of Marx and Fanon, or for that matter, every which way that they are relevant for our time. So I'm going to point to a few key elements of Marx's thought and Fanon's thought that I think we can find useful Now, when I was a graduate student in the US in the 1990s, can we actually lower the volume? I mean, there seems to be feedback or something. You're going to lower the volume to the volume. The lights. Oh, you don't have to see it. So long as you can hear me. So when I was a graduate student in the US through the 1990s, it was a rare course that offered anything more than a perfunctory reading of Marx's works. His ideas, Marx's ideas in the early 1990s and the mid 1990s were taken as debunked and defunct. His politics is hopelessly utopian. His methodology vitiated by Eurocentrism and Orientalism. Edward Said's criticisms in particular had resonated widely, and I would say by the mid 90s had become pretty much commonplace and axiomatic in critical theory circles. The collapse of the USSR was taken as the final nail in the coffin, proving the unviability of communism. Never mind that a totalitarian state that enriched a new bureaucratic elite was hardly the kind of thing Marx and Engels had in mind when they envisioned a society where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Now, fast forward through the years that followed, the Asian crisis of the mid-1990s, the dot-com boom and bust, the near collapse of the global financial system in 2008. And we find that Marx's insistence that capitalism is a crisis-ridden system begins to sound less like economic theory and more like common sense. And this is a famous passage, of course, from the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels are talking about the economic crises that periodically break out under capitalism. And they write that in these crises, the crises that are produced by capitalism are characterized by a fundamental absurdity. All previous societies dealt with crises that were born of scarcity. As populations grew, they invariably found it difficult to sustain those populations or societies that expanded too quickly, empires that expanded too quickly found themselves unable to sustain it. And it was scarcity that drove crises, social crises, economic crises, and so on in the past. Capitalism, though, is different because we have the crisis, the absurd crisis of overproduction that repeatedly finds itself and that repeatedly makes itself felt. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. And those of us who've lived through it, those of us actually, it's not to joke about, those of us who survived the pandemic can at least recognize that, when we went through those lockdowns, something happened. We suddenly discovered our lives weren't that much fun in certain ways, but we had a lot more leisure, the air was cleaner, there was less noise, etc., etc. And you get this idea that, we are living in a society where there's too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry. And anyone who's given even the most perfunctory thought to the problem of climate change, this idea can resonate with them as well. So that's at the level of structural contradictions. Now consider the contradictions of lived experience and ideology through these same decades, and we see both the constant ebb and flow, the emergence and re-emergence of social struggle on a mass scale. Think here of the experiences of the Indonesian revolt that brought down the hated dictator General Suharto in 1998, or the equally inspiring Egyptian revolt of 2011 that that was sort of the second domino in the Arab Spring after Tunisia. From Occupy Wall Street to the Hong Kong revolt, from the Black Lives Matter movement in the US to the mass protests in India against the Citizenship Amendment Act, workers, students, and the oppressed have risen up over and over again as if to confirm the opening lines of Part 1 of the Communist Manifesto, that history is the history of class struggle, and that struggle never actually ceases, that struggle is uninterrupted, even though at times it may seem hidden and at times bubble up to the surface. So the relevance of Marx, not just for an understanding of sort of structural contradictions, but also for an understanding of human agency and the power of human agency, of collective agency to transform society, should be obvious when you look at these decades. But on the other hand, when we consider how these same movements that I'm talking about, when they are successful in overthrowing the hated oppressor, have often failed to offer any alternative to the governments they bring down. You know, think about Egypt again, 2011, but also Indonesia, 1998, and Sri Lanka right now as we speak. You know, after the overthrow of the Rajapakshas, there's a vacuum, and one would think with a mass movement at the head of the zeitgeist, if you will, one would think that this is the perfect opportunity to offer an alternative to the depredations of capitalism, climate change, and all of the things that a country like Sri Lanka has been experiencing. But it seems very likely that instead we're going to see some of, at least a certain period of business as usual. Meaning, in this case, not very usual, not very normal, but incredibly harsh austerity measures, repression, and so on and so forth. So when we observe that these same struggles have not actually provided an alternative, then we're reminded of Marx's statement in the 18 Brumaire that men make their own history. And you know, we have to acknowledge that Marx's language of his time was marked by the inherent sexism of the time, of the discourse. But the point here is that human beings make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances that directly encounter the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. The past is not so easily jettisoned. It's not so easy to get rid of habits of the past, which return again and again to offer themselves as solutions to a system that is in crisis, even though those solutions have been tried before and haven't actually worked. Until an alternative presents itself, the tradition of the tradition of dead generations weighs like a nightmare. So, of course, it's possible to cherry pick quotes from any writer and show how those quotes are relevant to any given time. Even a broken clock is correct twice a day, right? So, what about Marx's overall method? Historical materialism as a method in particular came under attack in the 80s and 90s during the so-called cultural turn, with a whole host of theories that wish to push us into some sort of post-foundational meaning, post-foundational era. That is, we were expected now to let go of any grounding theory, of any theory that claimed to explain things. But if you think about that passage on historical materialism, the famous one, which I'm going to just read out here, it's kind of long to put on a slide, so I'm just going to give you the taste of it. This is a passage that I'm sure anyone who's familiar with Marx will recognize, where Marx writes, in the social production of their existence, and this is from Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their social existence. It is the but their social existence that determines their consciousness, right? And the passage goes on to talk about the conditions that then produce revolution and how we need to analyze the revolution itself differently from the way people think about it. The revolutionary process itself needs to be analyzed at a different level of analysis than the ideological, legal, and so on debates that go on about it. The key point here is that the idea of social being determining consciousness, I think, is incredibly powerful and incredibly relevant. Regardless of how we may approach the method more generally, that is, one doesn't have to be, you may not necessarily find historical materialism as a method fully convincing, but it does allow us to understand how the economic, political, social, and cultural realms are interconnected. One doesn't have to be reductionist or deterministic in one's approach to these interconnections, but I don't think you can defer the final instance of economic determination indefinitely. In other words, sooner or later, the realization just kicks in that yes, it is about the money. You know, that eventually comes back as the truth, as the concrete truth. Of course, Marx and Engels weren't always right, certainly weren't privy to much of what we understand today about things like, say, race, gender, and sexuality. And yet they left behind a body of work that was quite ahead of their time. And we could take up some of this in discussion, maybe I don't have much time to go into it in detail. For instance, we can think about Marx's writings on colonialism, racism, and slavery as the bedrock of capitalism, not really the bedrock, the precondition of capitalism. That wonderful passage in Das Kapital, where he talks about capitalism coming into being, dripping from head to toe with the blood and sweat of slaves. You know, it's a really powerful passage, and it gives the lie to people who say that Marx was Eurocentric, Orientalist, and so on and so forth. In fact, he sees European modernity as built upon colonialism and imperialism, etc.
I hate to interrupt you, but I thought I could cite a particular passage to reinforce the point that you're making here, and also hear Marx again, and quote Marx from Capital, Volume 1. The colonial system, Nagesh talking about Marx's own writings. So one passage, the colonial system ripened like a hothouse, trade and navigation. The colonies secured a market for the building manufacturers, and through the monopoly of the market, an increased accumulation. The treasures captured outside Europe by undisguised looting, enslavement, and murder floated back to the mother country and were then turned into capital. So while talking about even these, talking about capital, Marx wasn't really losing sight of the colonies that also contributed to the advancement of that capital. So there is that thing in Marx. Just wanted to share this with you. I hope you find
No.
Just got it.
Thank you. It is supposed to be.
Thank you.
So and at the end of that passage, he talks about how the veiled slavery of the textile mills in Manchester required as their pedestal slavery naked, pure and simple in the New World. Right? So that's a very explicit relationship between slavery in the New World and wage slavery as Marx talked. So there's that. But we don't have to make Marx into some prophet or some sort of seer, all-knowing, omniscient, crystal ball gazing, fortune teller, right? Much of what we make today of racism and racial identity and the nature of racial hierarchy and so on was only developed in the 20th century by writers and thinkers like W.B. Du Bois, Franz Fanon, and so on. And we can talk about that. So we can also think about Engels's, Marx's lifetime collaborator and friend. His book on the origins of family, private property, and the state, which is full of errors, prejudices of the time, and so on, but lays out a basic materialist framework for the understanding of women's oppression, which was way ahead of its time. It's inadequate for us today, as Marxists since then, and Marxist feminists that have developed, more expanded, have developed the theory further and taken it into new directions, such as social reproduction theory and so on, which actually complements rather than supplants Engels' ideas. So a lot has been developed by Marxists since Marx's time, which makes the work richer, makes the corpus of work richer and more relevant for us today as well. Now, moving to Franz Fanon, Fanon's work was and is less well known outside of African and African American studies and postcolonial studies. But even within these fields, it was really handfuls of Fanon scholars who kept alive the interest in his work. Within postcolonial studies, where I encountered Fanon in the 90s, there was a fresh profusion of Fanon scholarship throughout the 80s and 90s. And there was a kind of tug of war between post-structuralist postcolonialists and Marxist postcolonialists over Fanon's legacy. And post-structuralists drawing on variously on Lacan and Derrida and Foucault. But all of this, this produced some really rich scholarship, and it also produced several Fanons, several usable, workable Fanons, but often mutually irreconcilable Fanons as well, which is kind of true of Marx as well. So in this sense, Fanonism was never proclaimed dead the way Marxism was. No one really said that Fanonism is dead. Marxism has been killed many times. Its death has been proclaimed dead. Not so for Fanon. Yes, Fanon has been shunned as an apostle of violence, but also hailed as a theorist of national, and wrongly, but I should say, shunned as an apostle of violence, based on, I think, a misreading of the chapter called Concerning Violence, Repression of the Other. But also hailed as a theorist of national liberation and admired for his insight into the phenomenology of racism and the lived experience of the black person, black man, actually. Now, in a capitalist world system, where as a consequence of European imperialism and the hegemony of cultures of European modernity, in a capitalist world system that's driven, that's underpinned by the hegemony of cultures of European modernity, we will always see human subjects being produced and reproduced as racialized subjects. As long as capitalism exists with its need to differentiate, or the way A. Sivanandan, the Sri Lankan theorist, thinker, activist, put it, colonialist capitalism integrates in order to exploit what it divides in order to rule. And as long as capitalism exists, that dynamic, on the one hand, integration of markets, globalization, etc., etc. On the other hand, more and more divisions amongst people, that dynamic, as long as that dynamic exists, cannot, and that dynamic produces human beings as racialized subjects, Fanon's classic black skin, white masks will always remain relevant. Now, some of us here might find black skin, white masks to be intimidating, alienating, partly because it doesn't speak so easily to our experience. In South Asian societies, we haven't lived in our experience among white racist, white supremacist communities, and so this book, which is a searing, sort of very close examination of the phenomenon of racism and its lived experience, might sometimes feel alienating. However, I want you to think about the book in somewhat more flexible terms. It's not just about black and white, but it's about all the different shades that we do in supposedly homogenous society, that we do, the various shades of prejudice and the various shades of color that we too see amongst ourselves, but also the opening parts of Black Skin, White Masks the opening parts are very telling, especially in among gatherings like this, where you have people who return from abroad. And these returnees, stick out like sore thumbs. You can look around the room and you know who it is. Right? And so Fanon is describing here the strange transformation that happens to the native intellectual who goes abroad, who goes to the mother country and comes back. And he says this phenomenon is sort of, and this is useful for students here, right? Because when you're a professor, you can get their psychology pretty black skin, white mask. But, so he talks, I'll just give you one instance of this. He talks about how, so the native intellectual goes to the mother country, right? Goes to England or France or the US or wherever, goes to the West, because they feel like they're lacking something. They need to complete themselves. They need to finish. I had a friend, and I'll just say this anecdotally. I have a friend from my days in college in India, who, in all sincerity, in all earnestness, went to Europe to find her roots. She's from Bangalore, South India. Her parents are South Indian. She went to Europe to find her roots. Stayed there for about 7 years and came back educated about her roots. She realized they weren't in Europe. But so there's this moment of black skin, white mask, where these native intellectuals, they go abroad, they come back as if they completed the circle, as if they somehow not completed. So they come back literally full of themselves. So that's So even if the experience of living in white supremacist society doesn't kind of resonate with you, some of these passages about the returnees and about the relationship between native intellectuals and whiteness it will still bring truth. Because race, as Fanon tells us, is a social construct. We understand that today. It's not biological. There's nothing biological about race. It's a social construct that has its roots in early modern European prejudices of caste and region, that then acquires a life of its own with the development of so-called scientific racism in the 19th century. Fanon understands. Fanon understands blackness not as a biological given, not as a biological given, but as a product of the colonial encounter. And this understanding of blackness updates and expands on W.E.B. Du Bois's earlier articulation of the two-ness or double consciousness felt by the black person in America. So I won't spend too much time on this, but Du Bois in his classic book, The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, had put out this idea that the black person in America faces this push and pull between an American identity and a black identity, and these sees these as two ideals sort of warring within the black person. And he says what the black person wants is simply to be able to exist as both American and black. And he says one ever feels this two-ness, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strides, two warring ideas in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being drawn asunder. For Fanon, the ontological status of blackness, that is, what is blackness, right, is not to be assumed, and a black person's salvation lies not so much in finding a way to reconcile their blackness as in extricating themselves from a host of complexes that define them as black. Which is a very different thing from saying, how can I be black or how can I be brown and an American? Or how can I, it's more about saying we have to find a way to pull people of color out of a set of complexes that are trapping them in blackness and in color prejudice. Blackness and whiteness are the straps that must be dismantled. Right? So in this quote, he says that black is not a man. Man is a yes. Right? So there's this humanism that Fanon is driven by, a radical humanism that says we have to recover the human, which is right now trapped and distorted within discourses of race. Black men are men who are black. In other words, going what? So my slides haven't my slides haven't been showing. Oh, okay, well, okay. That's my fault because I had this. No, that's correct. Why is it not? So it looks like let's just keep. Did the slide not change at all?
No. You can start again.
Oh.
No.
That's, but this was a brilliant talk. That's okay. Oh, you asked me. Okay, that's fine. Okay, that's okay. So, but okay, I'll just show you the slides. Just, so you know they're there. You get a brief recap of what I'm talking about. Okay, so this Du Bois quote, I was trying to point out how, Du Bois takes for granted a certain kind of givenness, ontological givenness of race. In 1903, he couldn't have done otherwise. And Fanon sort of moving past that, moving beyond that, and saying, we're not black. Black is not a man. Man is a yes to cosmic, resonating for cosmic harmonies. It's the humanity of man. Black men are men who are black. In other words, owing to a series of affective disorders, they are settled into a universe in which we have to extricate. In other words, there's no such thing as black or white except in relation to one another, and through a hierarchical process that is created, that is trapped, both of them, in a series of psychoaffective disorders. So, and he spent a lot of time analyzing these disorders and how they manifest throughout black skin, white masks. And there's a lot to say about it, but obviously we don't have time to go through it in detail. Okay, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protest movement in the US, which was prompted by an epidemic of police killings of black men and women, Fanon's description of the lived experience of the black man resonated particularly strongly with my black students. This was, after the Black Lives Matter movement, which you might have heard about, some of you might have heard about. How many of you have heard of the Black Lives Matter movement? Okay. So it's still sort of in your memories, So there's no question that these protests changed the consciousness of students who participated in them, or even just lived through that summer, especially after George Floyd's killing. Fanon describes the descent into a subjective hell brought on by everyday instances of racism, and the resulting nausea and shame that racism produces in the black subject. And in him, these passages are biographical. He's actually describing his own experiences. I'm not going to read it in the interest of time. Leads him to the discovery or rediscovery of a black past, a history and a culture via the poets of Negritude, I may say, in Leopold Senghor, who encourage him to embrace the very blackness that has so far stifled and suffocated his existence. Sorry. I'm sorry, I've got a little distracted slightly, but back on track here. I'm going to rush through a little bit so that we can move to a close and open up for discussion. So I remember well when Black Lives Matter protests happened on my campus at Colgate University, we sat and listened for literally hours and hours on end as black student after student, one student after another took the mic to narrate their experience of precisely the kind of thing that Fanon was describing, that Fanon describes in Black Skin, White Masks. He describes this incident that takes place in a train. I was going to read it out, but to summarize it for you. It's an incident where, a child sort of, points at him and says, look, mama, a black man. The child is holding on to his mother, mama, a black man. And then it goes on to the point where suddenly the child says, look, mama, a black man, I'm scared. And at that moment, he describes a sort of what he calls a zone of non-being that sends you into. And his prose itself kind of mimics that descent into hell and ends in a kind of nausea. It's a brilliant, very moving passage. And when Black Lives Matter students were describing their experiences of racism and so on, sort of like something, it really resonates with what Fanon is talking about here. The word microaggressions became part of common parlance. Testimonials of trauma took the place of political speeches at many protests. The movement for Black Lives, like Fanon, finds refuge in a black past and a black identity rescued from European prejudice and bias. But finding refuge in a black past will not liberate black people, as it still means remaining trapped within the logic of what Fanon calls the dual narcissism, that is blackness and whiteness. Right? He said the black man is trapped in his blackness, the white man is trapped in his whiteness. Confronted with the white man, the black man has to try to present his past as worthy, as valuable, and as just as important as the white man's past, etc., etc. So the black man is, in that sense, because of this dynamic, trapped in the past. He says it's always in service to the past. Finding refuge in the past, therefore, won't actually get you out of this dual narcissism that racism produces. Okay. Yes. Okay. Come to a conclusion. Okay. So, okay. We'll. All right. Let me just. I'll give it. I'll bring it to a close. Let's say 5 minutes. Is that good?
And that won't be a decisive conclusion because you and I will also
Okay.
There will be many.
So
you will have the time to talk.
we'll conclude again. Okay. Okay. So let me just say this. So at the end of Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon urges us to move to a politics that's defined by a humanism that refuses the black-white binary as its structuring principle. He rejects negritude and its quest for identity rooted in an African past because it's not a universalizable idea. Black elites, he says, black elites might embrace blackness as a response to their alienation, but he says this offers little respite to, this is a quote, my poor brother suffering with his neuroses to the extreme. In other words, he's saying, there's a class dimension to how we approach things like blackness. Elite blacks can embrace blackness to sort of disalienate themselves, as it were. But for working class blacks, that seems to be ruled out. Rediscovering Bantu philosophy, Fanon says, is pointless. When Bantu society is poverty-stricken and oppressed. We would be overjoyed to learn of the existence of a correspondence between some black philosopher and Plato, but we can absolutely not see how this fact would change the lives of 8-year-old kids working in the cane fields in Martinique and Guadeloupe. Now, you could argue that this is reductionist because there's something valuable in that cultural inheritance and in that cultural archaeology. But what Fanon is trying to point to here is that negritude is a moment, is a necessary moment of reclaiming blackness, but that can't be, that isn't the end point of black liberation. We haven't even been able to talk about the rest of the year, so we'll leave that alone. I will just conclude with this, that for Fanon, as for us, the task, as I say, as it should be for us, the task is to find what Fanon calls a socio-diagnostic of the neuroses and illnesses that we find among us. That is, it's not enough to think about individual psychology, and we need to go beyond individual psychology and actually think in terms of the social genesis of neuroses and problems created by racism, imperialism, and colonialism. And once we do that, we must recognize, he says, that genuine disalienation, that it's not a matter of that liberation and disalienation, that is, racism produces alienated individuals. Genuine disalienation is not going to come by, talking about the salvation of the soul. He says genuine disalienation will have been achieved only when things in the most materialist sense have resumed their rightful place. Right? And I think that's the sort of principle, guiding principle that we should have going forward. Okay, thank you, and I hope we can have a full discussion about this.
Thank you, Nagesh. That was, I think, an immensely useful, introductory, expository, and anecdote talk. And all at the same time. And you have already introduced and welcome. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Already dwelt on a number of issues, number of ideas, Marxian and Fanonian, that remain relevant to our times. So what I'm supposed to get into some kind of conversation here, but this is actually Nagesh's event. He's the protagonist of this event. I'm just a side character. But in order to continue this conversation along the path Nagesh has already charted, I would preface it with a poem. I will read a poem, Fanonian, Caliban, one that directly I take refers to Fanon's idea of zone of non-being, to which you alluded. So I will start with a poem. Is that all right? Some of you, in fact, some of my former students wanted me to read a poem about Marx. There's a poem that I translated into Bengali for something like that, and that poem is about the relevance of Marx. It's by a Peruvian black poet, communist poet. He wrote that one, and he read that particular poem at a rally, and then he shared it with me, and he gave it to me, and that very night I ended up translating his poem into Bengali, one that I would like to share probably at the end. A poem. I will do that in Bengali. So some of you wanted me to do. So I will use that thing. The poem is called 10,000 Atypical Haiku Dedicated to California. Point out here that Fanon himself, in Black Skin, White Mask, the text that Nagesh has so ably taken up, but in that very text, Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon criticizes, I think Menonist work called Prospero and Caliban, the psychology of colonization. In fact, Fanon wants Caliban to be much more revolutionary, and that was the case actually with Amos Cazad. Nagesh mentioned Amos Cazad, the Caribbean. Amos Cazad was the Caribbean revolutionary Marxist poet, famous for his prose work called Discourse on Colonialism, which appeared in 1955, and that also influenced Fanon quite a bit. So I wrote this, this haiku, atypical haikus. If I can use a haiku in the plural, it's non-grammatical. I don't think the song, but I don't care. The plural, atypical haikus dedicated to Caliban. So who is Caliban? Who is Prospero? Now, in Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, you have these two major characters, Prospero and Caliban. Prospero is this master, and Caliban is this slave. Prospero is this colonizer, and Caliban the colonized. And the relationship between Prospero and Caliban is this relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. So at one point, Caliban gets angry in the play. Caliban gets angry, and here again, I'm taking up the question of language, and Franz Fanon, in fact, began his book, Black Skin, White Mask, with this statement. And that first chapter is on language. And he puts it this way: I ascribe a fundamental importance to the question of language. That's on language. So, and this also takes up this language. So I wrote this And I have a couple of epigraphs. The first one is taken from an Iraqi poet, Ibn Ashraf, and his poem is called, very interestingly titled, Hegel Construction Company Limited. And to quote Ibn Ashraf, who gives a shit about the measure we dictate? I, for one, believe in the politics of extra syllables and bad rhymes. Unquote. And now Caliban himself, this is from Shakespeare, Shakespeare's play The Tempest. You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. আমি তো বাংলায় এভাবে সাধারণত বলে থাকি যে তুমি তো আমাকে এখন ইংরেজি ভাষাটা শিখিয়েছো, আমার উপর ইংরেজি ভাষাটা চাপিয়ে দিয়েছো, এখন এই ইংরেজি ভাষা আমি শিখেছি, আমি হয়তো ক্ষেত্র বিশেষে তোমার থেকেও আমি ইংরেজি ভাষা ভালো করে ব্যবহার করতে পারি। আমার সুবিধা হচ্ছে এখন আমি ইংরেজি ভাষায় তোমাকে বলতে পারি চুদলাম না, এটা তখন তুমি বুঝবে। So that's it. You taught me language, but my profit on it is I know how to curse. Now, I go on. Caliban, and this is the zone of being, non-being. Caliban, run. I know it's no fun. 2, Caliban, be in between being and seeming. Caliban is drinking. Number 3, Caliban is stinking while Prospero is puking, and who sings from him? 4, a fleshy white guy. Caliban's a dream and boredom he wants to buy. 5, you care and you care, but I don't. Rain or sunshine, history or snare. 6, layer upon layer, you make the same old damn point on my foot, on my head. 7, progress is history's dirty joke, or it's bad rhyme. Caliban fakes his things. 8, Caliban comes back. In boredom, under the moon, someone drops a black. 9, be quiet, Caliban. Don't dirty my veranda. Caliban takes a U-turn. And last, number 10, the night's dark, it's ink. Caliban pees on the brink. His pea stains stick and stink. So I'll get into some stinky discourse now. Now, taking cues and clues from Nagesh's own talk, which I find extremely provocative too. And can we really read Marx without reading him together with Fanon, or together with, for that matter, W.B. Du Bois and A.B. Césaire and C.L.R. James? In other words, can we even remotely conceptualize, let alone mobilize, what has been called, sometimes according to some mistakenly, Marx's labor theory of value in today's context, without simultaneously positing what I wish to call, and if time permits, I will formulate this at some length, if time permits during our conversation, a race theory of value. So I'll return to this. Now, Black Skin, White Mask, is my favorite text. I love it. I return to it, and I keep learning from it every time. And there are all kinds of things there, that I find still provocative. But there's another text, one that I find very important, The Wretched of the Earth. It appeared in the year 1961. Fanon was then struggling with life and death, was sick, and he dictated this particular text. Stuart Hall, not that I'm always crazy about Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall once described Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth as the Bible of decolonization. So when we talk about the question of decolonization, we bring up Fanon. Fanon is very relevant when we're concerned with the problem of decolonization in Bangladesh. I think I earlier raised this question. Jonas is here, Dr. Raisi is here. They will be able to address probably at some point later. So what does a revolutionary politics look like in a country like Bangladesh? I think it's a very, very important question as far as I'm concerned. So there is that thing. Anyways, so the wretched of the art. Why? And I'm totally with Dennis Walter, the South African critic, who maintains, and I quote just a few lines, Fanon's The Wretched of the Art remains more important for anti-colonial thinking. Why? Why? In the first place, Fanon wrote from the perspective of a colonial subject in the thick of an independence struggle, the Algerian liberation movement, let's say, of 1954, 1962. Addressing other colonial subjects, the wretched of the art has spoken more directly, profoundly, and lastingly than any other single anti-colonial work on behalf of anti-colonized, unquote. Now, here is the thing. Although Walters, I've just quoted this Walter on The Wretched of the Art, although Walters' account seems a little bit, exaggerated, others from, and I'm mentioning some Fanon scholars here, René Zahar and Peter Geisler, through Irene Gensier and Emmanuel Hansen, down to Cedric Robinson, whose work I find immensely useful, and is famous for his work for Black Marxism, and Edward Said. Their different approaches to Fanon, notwithstanding, suggest that the wretched of the art is Fanon's most explicit. By no means, however, do I imply the wretched of the art. I'm still in some kind of conversation. Don't worry, I need to introduce some ideas here, then we'll get into a conversation. So the wretched of the art, by no means do I think that the wretched of the art, for that matter, inaugurates a complete epistemological break with Fanon's earlier works, or even with his first major work, White Masks. Now I have to quote Stuart Hall a little bit, and he puts it this way: Fanon's first and most explicitly psychoanalytical text. It might be very explicitly psychoanalytical, but I don't know. Probably agree with me if I say that the psychoanalytical is very much political in Fanon's case. So we do psychoanalysis here in Bangladesh, we do, and I see the need for psychoanalysis. But it becomes so technical sometimes, so technical, so obscure, so detached from actual life that it ends up overdosing on what I would call abstractions. But if we can politicize psychoanalysis, then it would be probably more useful. In other words, it can bring Lacan and Lenin together. And I'm not just using these two names for the sake of alliteration only. I see the point. There might be some other things, but that's altogether a different issue. Now, Fanon's most explicit psychoanalytical text. But I turn to The Wretched of the Art mainly for the reason that more than any of Fanon's works, The Wretched not only provides theories and strategies of the politics of colonial domination and decolonization in a sustained manner, but also offers insights into a political economy of racism and colonialism. If you recall earlier, I just briefly mentioned this, a Fanonian reading of Marx and the Marxian reading of Fanon. How do you do that? What is so Marxist about Fanon? Is there anything Marxist about Fanon? Is there anything Fanonian about Marx? Yes. I would argue that yes. And how do you, for instance, Marxianize Fanon and Fanonize Marx? We have to take up the question of political economy. Fanon was interested in political economy among many other things, of course. There are post-colonial theorists who have bypassed the question of Fanon's concern with political economy, have ended up focusing on culture so much that they become some kind of culturalist. There is this culturalism there, which in fact doesn't do justice, I would argue, to Fanon's oeuvre, particularly The Wretched of the Art. The Wretched of the Art is concerned with, among other things, the question of political economy. His interest in political economy, in fact, brings Fanon close to Marx. And in fact, Fanon takes cues and clues from key Marxist text. It's called a key Marxist text. There are debates surrounding that particular text. It's Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. When I read that one, I know this from reading Fanon's biography, and Fanon to an extent drew up. It's not that he didn't, because that very text appeared already towards the beginning of the 20th century, and as I already told you, Fanon's The Legend of the Art appeared in 1961. Now here is the thing though, connections between Marx and Fanon. Here is the thing, Fanon himself, Fanon has his own imperative that he has mobilized in The Legend of the Art, saying, and I quote Fanon, a very interesting, important statement, which is this. Fanon says, Marxist is talking about Marxist analysis. Fanon, directly on Marxist analysis, Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time you have to do with the colonial problem, unquote. This is Franz Fanon on Marxist analysis. Now, I argue that Fanon does not abandon his Marxism, Marx as such, but only stretches it in an attempt to provide insights into the logic of capital in the colonial context and into the logics of colonialism and racism, profoundly interconnected as they remain in the capitalist context itself. And Fanon does so, I argue, in ways in which those very logics bring together both the categories of class and race into a dialectically charged and active interaction, even clearing and purging the space for fashioning what might be called a race theory of class. Briefly put, a race theory of class, as Fanon's own work tends to envisage, points that production relations under modern capitalism have historically remained race relations in such a way that race itself comes to constitute class, and that thus one cannot sufficiently account for class formations without considering race as a determining factor. But Fanon doesn't articulate his political economic insights and ideas in a sustained and systematic manner in the Legend of the Art. Of course, he's not a political economist in the sense that Karl Marx or Ernest Mandel was, but I agree with Peter Christ when he points out that the Legend of the Art was never intended as a detailed analysis of economic change. It was more clearly an Odile the combat, meaning part of the war against colonialism. However, Fanon makes revealing and instructive and sometimes tangential, yet suggestive remarks on political economy in the Legend of the Art while pursuing many other trajectories of the colonial condition and possible decolonization. So if you can bring together, and also to use Fanon's own term, stretch, Fanon's own remarks, however sporadic and scattered, on the dialectical logic of colonialism and racism and capitalism, we can probably critically elaborate a particular brand of political economy, of colonialism and racism in contemporary context. And this political economy of colonialism and racism that we can, articulate, in fact, gives us this idea and shows us the connections between Marx and Fanon. So anyways, now another thing that brings, last point, brings Marx, close to Fanon, rather Fanon close to Marx, and as is evident in the Legend of the Art, Fanon pits, hyphenatedly speaking, colonial, racialized, indigenous, agrarian, labor against metropolitan capital on the one hand, and against the national bourgeoisie, or even against the urban ruling class in the colonized territory on the other, thus suggesting that a political economy of colonialism must take into account both the categories of race and class, rather different classes in their dialectical opposition and transaction, both in the beginning chapter of the Legend of the Art, in fact, immediately foregrounds a race-class dialectic characterizing the colonial condition. Fanon, for instance, writes, and I find this passage from the Legend of the Art very instructive, very revealing. In the colonies, the economic substructure is also a superstructure. The cause is the consequence. You are rich because you are white. You are white because you are rich. This is why, then he says, this is why Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we do with the colonial problem. I think in this particular passage, Fanon, for the first time, provides a quick but a crucial outline, what I have already called, repeatedly called, a political economy of colonialism and racism. And economy, to begin with, is predicated on a dialectical unity, interplay between Marxist spatial architectural tropes such as superstructure and substructure. Fanon uses the term substructure, and Marxist term is base, and like Antonio Gramsci, Fanon complicates the narrowly economistic Marxist within quote Marx. I use quote Marx. I never thought Marx. I don't think Marx is an economic determinist. But there are certain Marxists who, in fact, have historically speaking showed that tendency. So narrowly economistic within quote Marxist model of base economy and superstructure, which is broadly speaking ideology, politics, law, and culture too. The model in question delimits the material and analytical horizons of both base and superstructure through positing a causally determined and binary relationship between those two categories, base and superstructure, while thus postulating that the base always already determines the structure, superstructure. Fanon moves beyond this determinist and binarist model of cause and effect. Rather, he suggests the possibility of enacting a more dialectically engaged political economic approach to the colonial problematic of production relations, whereby, to use Fanon's own term, the substructure or base itself can rightly be viewed as superstructure and vice versa. In the passage that I shared with you earlier, Fanon also speaks of an economy in which capitalism and colonialism support and strengthen one another, an economy in whose historically specific configuration of production relations and power relations, Marx's privileged category of class is never abandoned, but only slightly stretched, to use Fanon's words again, so as to accommodate the category of race. Fanon, for instance, repeatedly observed that whites exist as rich classes and the rich classes exist as whites. I can go on and on stretching, but I will stop here. And just to quickly mention this, that I don't think, and this is my argument, and I don't think that we can actually talk about Marx-Fanon connections without taking into account Fanon's own interest in political economy as such. So stop here, and I'll take another issue. And I'm back. Here it is. It's just that sometimes I enjoy speaking, like standing up. Not that I don't want to sit down for it. So here, so thanks again. Here is the thing. I've noticed a couple of for instance, you talked about Marx's. Just one second. Just one thing. Of course, I will open this and then I will start. So, you talked about, results of federalism. If you recall, in terms of science critique of Marx, I don't call science critique as such. It's just that Said is a great theorist, no doubt about that. I love Said and have deep admiration for Said's work. I've been using Said's work for quite some time. But when it comes to Marx's work, he just relies on, as you know, I think you said it here, he relies on a passage or two from Marx's works, while bypassing a number of, Marx wrote as many as 39 dispatches on India. But Said's understanding of Marx, I would argue that it was very limited. And later on in his life, Said stopped criticizing Marx. He stopped, actually, he didn't. And also, what happened was that Said also didn't want to call himself post-colonial, like post-colonial theorist, and developed some kind of allergy towards the end of his life to this very term. So just wanted to share. Anyway, so let's open. So let me open out now. We have an open discussion. If you have any questions, concerns, observations, etc., you're very welcome to share it. Please. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both. I have a question that might be for both of you. I thought the whole conversation, knowing what I know of Marx and Fanon, the entire conversation would be structured around the stretching of Marxism. I mean, it seems like an obvious connection, right? And yet perhaps you were about to get to it and you ran out of time, right? And you quoted a really nice passage from Marx on slavery, whatever, colonialism. And I'm curious why neither of you use the term racial capitalism, especially because the talk is called The Relevance of Fanon and Marx Today. And as our friend Pia Gopal and many others have shown, it's impossible. And I think what Fanon does, as you very well showed us, is show how it's impossible to disentangle race from class, and one shouldn't even try. So is there a particular question? I mean, if we're talking about Bangladesh, I certainly, when I think about the garment industry, as you're talking about overproduction, whatever, I think of racial, I tend to see the ways in which a concept of racial capitalism would be very, very relevant. So for both of you, but since you were the first person, why not talk about racial capitalism?
Just one second. I didn't finish, but here is the thing, thanks for raising this question. I'm totally with you. And at the beginning, at the outset, when I was introducing Nagesh, I somewhat dwelt on the connection between Marx and Fanon. And there I said, let me mark mine. I think I can reproduce some of the things I said there. So yes, politics, how would this revolutionary politics look like at a conjuncture characterized by the constitutive contradictions, crisis, and comparisons of capitalism, always racial. It's always racial, and mark my accent that falls on the word always. Right from the get-go, historical history. So I have already acknowledged that was my point of view.
I was there.
Sorry. Okay.
I didn't use the term racial capitalism for, I guess, two reasons. One is that I kind of spoke the point, that is, Marx's analysis of the origins of capitalism and capitalist modernity is predicated on racism, colonialism, and slavery. I was sort of making that point there in generation capitalism. Partly because I think I'm not entirely convinced yet that we need the term racial capitalism. I'm not quite convinced of that as a category. I'm still trying to make sense of this way of thinking about race as predating capitalism, because part of what racial capitalism, the theory of racial capitalism tends to do is, and I kind of mentioned it in what I'm saying, that is, it dates the origins of race and race thinking farther back than Marxists have, than the classical Marxist tradition is sort of put it. So the idea that racism comes out of intra-European prejudices and intra-European characterizations of which came out of caste societies, and that came out of sort of certain kinds of xenophobia and so on, and then developed into kind of recognizably racial categories that are then meet up with capitalist modernity and produce racial capitalism. At least that's the way I understand racial capitalism as a term. And I don't understand it fully, so I don't use it. So,
Post-1492 way in which race and modernity and capitalism together. That's another way to just think about it.
Yeah, but it's the question of how I understand that race, it's useful to talk about race, not just race, but in other places like ethnicity, nationality, even religion, and so on, can structure production relations. Yeah, I just think it's useful to think about. Yeah,
I do too. I just want
yeah. But just on Reginald Deere, that I wanted to say that to me, Reginald Deere's, I do think that there's a lot of there's so much. It's such a dense text, right? Yeah. There's a lot of analysis of political economy and how the political economy of the colony sort of underpins and constrains and blocks off possibilities even for the revolution, not just for bourgeoisie and other. So, but I think that Reginald Deere, I find it most valuable for what it says, what it teaches about strategy, about for what it teaches about political parties, how and the relationship, particularly the relationship between nationalism and reformism, the fundamentally anti-revolutionary reformism that nationalist bourgeoisies practice and that nationalism itself practices. And so when we come to that question of like the humanism that we see at the end of Black Skin, White Masks, where the white and the black have to both be rescued from their entrapment by the discourses of race. I think in Reginald Deere, the task seems to be, although he never explicitly puts it this way, but the task seems to be how to free people from the trap of nationhood and the trap of the nation state. So, it reminds me of Pastor Davidson's history, one of his, I don't know how many, 13 books on Africa, but one of them called The Black Man's Burden, Africa and the Curse of the Nation State. And I think Fanon was acutely aware. Fanon worked so tirelessly for African unity towards the end of his life. He was suffering with cancer, and he still made this crazy journey trying to find a route through the desert that allowed them to smuggle arms and stuff like that, because Algeria was on siege, etc. But he was working tirelessly for African unity, because he saw nationalism as a dead end. Fanon, I think, very often is sometimes read carelessly as an advocate of national culture. There's a chapter called on national culture.
And even as an advocate of violence, like violence.
And as an advocate of violence, there's a chapter called Concerning Violence. And he's really
Concerning
the challenge, the fact that he was concerned about violence, it's obvious because he was a psychiatrist, he was teaching, he was treating, not teaching, he was treating patients of violence, victims of violence, and perpetrators of violence in the same office. So he understood violence. And concerning violence is really, to me, to my mind, it's really about the violence of the colonial situation and the inevitability of violence, not so much the desirability of violence, even though there are times when you're not very close to romanticizing violence by saying it's a cleansing force, etc., etc. Right? But coming back to the question of Marxist, I think there's this quote at the end of the chapter on national culture, where Fanon says, national consciousness, which is not nationalism, is the only thing that will give us an international dimension. Right? And so when we think about how he was trying to offer a way out of colonialism through national liberation, and he worked for the national liberation struggle, and yet he was at pains throughout the text to excoriate the nationalists, to excoriate the nationalist bourgeoisie, and to say that they will lead the post-colonial nation into a client state, into a neo-colonial situation. That the nationalist bourgeoisie is only interested in transferring it to itself, into its hands, the powers of the colonial bourgeoisie, and it will convert the land into a haven for tourism, etc., etc. He also excoriates the national leadership and the way that it approaches liberation as a strategy, trying to sort of keep the masses in check, and at the same time trying to find a way to negotiate with the colonizers, etc., etc. So when you think about this, Fanon is an internationalist, right? He's an internationalist trapped in a situation where his internationalism does not receive reciprocity from the French left.
Very
Just like
yes,
the black
indeed.
man,
Yeah.
like the black man and black skin white class cannot get reciprocity from the white man, and that mutual recognition is denied to them. Very much is denied. Here, the solidarity that the French working class ought to have expressed towards Algerian workers standing up for their liberation was not forthcoming, partly because of the Stalinism of the French Communist Party, and partly because of the national chauvinism of the French working class, that they refused to see Algeria as separate, as different from France. So then Fanon is left in this sort of bind, which I think Marx, and this is where when Fanon said national consciousness is the only thing that gives us an international dimension. I think that's where we see a sort of connection there with Marx as well, because for Marx, the working class must first of all, settle matters with the common bourgeoisie. But as the domination of one class over another is overcome, so the domination of one nation over another can be overcome. For Marx, a nation that oppresses another can never be free. Marx also expresses this sort of idea of this sort of horizon, this idea of world culture that could, that could come to replace national narrow-mindedness and isolation and so on. The term that I would still like to use for that vision really is cosmopolitanism. I know that cosmopolitanism isn't a very friendly term for Marxists, but I think that there's a kind of grounded, rooted cosmopolitanism that forms the basis of Marx's utopian thinking, utopian vision. And that utopianism, that idea of a world beyond national borders, I think that idea still resonates.
Sure.
Or it lurks behind the championing of national liberation.
Thank you. Thank you. And I've been given this. And let me read this. There will be another program at 6:30 p.m. We should wrap up by 6:15. So there is actually. So I wanted to add a few things to this. Actually, I mean, for one, have found they are extremely useful for many of things. Then political economics such. But my argument I would understand that if you have to make some connection with what's so much about one of them, I cannot bypass the question. That's one. Second, as far as nationhood is concerned, I would say dead end, I think this is extremely important, very relevant in the context of competition. Bangladesh, there are all kinds of, not all kinds of, there are nationalists, and these nationalists have literally colonized what we call ethnic and linguistic and religious minorities. And do you know that again, that the Constitution, there's this amendment in the Constitution, in our Constitution that says that indigenous people should not use the term indigenous to describe themselves. Mark this. Indigenous people, Adivashi শব্দ ব্যবহার করা যাবে না। এবং Adivashi শব্দ আমরা দেখলাম just yesterday, in fact, talked about this. That we are indigenous people and we are forbidden to use the term indigenous. So this is going on. And so nationalists have created, this country. When I characterize the political culture of this country, I talk about the bureaucratization of politics and the politicization of programs. I talk about the communalization of politics and the politics of, using When I read religion, I talk about also the commercialization of politics and so on. They're all interconnected, and the militarization of politics. They're all interdisciplinary. And Fanon can help us understand all these trends in Bangladesh. So Fanon is extremely.
Also, I think the question that Fanon asks us to pay attention to is what is the value of nationalism when the moment of national liberation is past? What function does nationalism play when the colonizers have left, right? And what how does the national bourgeoisie and the national state mobilize that nationalism for its own purposes? And what happens? What happens to the aspirations of the masses who had fought in those struggle? Right? That question needs to be, especially when I as someone relative outside of Bangladesh, see the frequency with which 71 is involved as part of public culture. Something to think about. What's the status of nationalism once the moment of colonization is ended? That's the first thing. The second is, we're actually in a situation in South Asia of competitive nationalism and copycat nationalism, copycat authoritarianism. We have the same strategies that are being deployed across the border in India to bolster a kind of right-wing authoritarianism and a certain kind of nationalist authoritarianism. The same strategies of cracking down on dissent, etc., are operated here as well, equally draped to the national flag. Literally the same discourse that speaks of independence, liberation, etc. So these are, so it becomes relevant again. One place where Fanon, stretches Marx too much, he thinks, is in his assessment of the role of the working class. That's a big element that Fanon rejects the idea that the working class of the colonies can be an ally. He sees the working class as essentially part of imperialism, and he probably pushes that too far. I think in some ways reveals not a very good understanding really of the Algerian working class itself, because he didn't necessarily have much contact with it. So he sees the sub-proletariat, or what Marx called the proletariat. He sees the sub-proletariat as the revolution, right? As a revolutionary agent, which I think is a mistake, and I think that too relates back in some ways to the failures of the ECF to mobilize working class support, but also the Algerian Communist Party. But they, I think it raises kind of ignorance. Working classes come back to
So anyway, is there any question? We can have questions, comments, observations. We still have 7 minutes, at least. Just next time program, 6:30. Any questions? Any concern? Anything? Anybody? No? Do you want to say something? I call him our little revolutionary. I first met him in New York. I think yes, in Boston. Yeah. Any questions? Well, thank you. No questions. So, all right, then we're towards the end. I'm just wondering if I should read that 3-minute long poem and rapturize our great celebrated poets there. And reading this poem, a politically charged poem in translation. I'm not sure if I should do it. Thunderlight. Acting poetry. Anyways, Thanda. So let me bypass it, but you have any questions? Okay. All right, thank you. If you don't have any questions, then you don't have any questions. No, thank you so much, Nagesh. It's all the things you have shared with us. Let's give Nagesh a round of applause.
Thank you so much, especially Dr. Nagesh Rao for the interesting talk, and of course, Professor Azfar Hussain for a fascinating discussion. I'm sure the session has been a great learning opportunity for all of us, and we also had a very good engaging discussion. With that, I would now like to request Ms. Arifalani Rahman, Associate Professor and Head Department of English and Humanities, to present our guests with a token of appreciation.
Sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted to take a little opportunity here to say a couple of things. First of all, of course, thank you so much for doing this, being here with us. And I also have to absolutely thank Azfar sir for introducing us. And my apologies for coming in with ahead of family emergency and for cutting this discussion short. But hopefully we'll have the opportunity to get together, make it more interactive or open up the discussion a little bit more. Some of the technical results thank you so much for being here with us, and that's a wonderful discussion. And this is just a little token of our appreciation.
There is this token of appreciation for our distinguished speaker and others. Really? I wasn't expecting it.
Thank you, sir. So with that, we have come to the end of today's talk. I would like to thank a few people before closing this session. First of all, my courteous thanks to our honorable guest speaker, Dr. Nagesh Rao and Professor Azfar Hussain. Thank you so much, sir, for doing this. Thank you very much to Shamshad sir, who had to leave. Thanks a lot, Ms. Arifur Rahman, for all of your wonderful support. Thanks to my colleagues of DEH. Thanks to DEH Event Committee, Anika Tasin and Mr. Tajkia. My sincere thanks to our IT team, Communications Office, Admin Office, and support staff who made this event possible. Thank you very much, Admin Officers, IAPA and PCAPA. Many thanks to our volunteers and TAs. Thank you very much. And of course, our students and the audience who joined us today. Before we move on, we have some light refreshments just outside the auditorium. I would like to also take some time to announce and invite you all back at this same location on Saturday, that is August 13 at 5 p.m. for the 4th ULab Literary Salon on the partition and its aftermath. Do join us then. Thank you all again for joining and have a wonderful rest of the evening. Bye.